That Thanksgiving night, the rain fell in torrents, enveloping our house in a dreary, cold veil of grey water. Our family was small, just my mother, Tony, and me living in an old house near the edge of a small forest on the outskirts of town. The whole area was so quiet that when the rain came, only the sound of rustling leaves and trickling water broke the silence. My father had passed away years ago, and my mother always did her best to keep the holiday spirit alive. But that Thanksgiving, the atmosphere was entirely different. Gloomy, heavy. My grandparents lived not far from us, about a 10-minute drive. They were the closest relatives we had left. Over the years, the family had dwindled, leaving these holidays as the only thread connecting us. Still, every year, Thanksgiving was prepared meticulously, almost like a ritual. My mother would cook a grand meal with all the traditional dishes: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and of course, her famous pies, which she took the most pride in. That day, it had rained without pause since early morning, plunging the house into a dark and cold silence. The rain pounded against the windows like thousands of icy hands clapping in unison, with none of the warmth usually associated with Thanksgiving. By noon, my mother was already busy in the kitchen. Tony was absorbed in his video games in his room, and I sat staring out the window, watching the rain fall, sensing that something was wrong, something unsettling that I couldn't quite put into words. Around 5 p.m., my grandparents arrived in the middle of the downpour, and I went out to help them inside. Both of them were getting on in years, and the slippery path made me nervous. When we finally got back inside, my mother had finished preparing the meal, and at exactly 6 p.m., as was our yearly tradition, we sat down to eat. The meal unfolded normally, but there was something strange in the air. The rain kept pouring outside, and occasionally a distant rumble of thunder echoed through the night. Our old house, which was always somewhat dim, now felt even more cold and desolate under the faint yellow light spilling from the living room. We talked, trying to keep the conversation light and cheerful, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, cutting through the sound of the heavy rain, startling all of us. Who could possibly be here at this hour, in such weather? My mother stopped eating, a look of concern flickering in her eyes. Who could it be at this time? She muttered. "I'll go check," I said, standing up from the table. I walked down the hallway toward the front door. The dim porch light barely illuminated the figure outside. Through the rain-streaked glass, I could make out the shape of a tall, motionless figure standing there, not moving. A chill ran down my spine. "Who is it?" I called out, but my voice was drowned out by the sound of the heavy rain. There was no response. I glanced through the small side window, seeing the figure standing there, utterly still. I decided not to open the door right away. "Who is it?" I called again, louder this time, but still no reply. After a few seconds of eerie silence, I turned to my mother and grandparents. "It's probably just someone lost," I said, though I couldn't hide the unease in my voice. My mother stood up and walked over to me. She peered out and tightened the lock on the front door. "We're not expecting anyone else. Probably just a homeless person wandering by," she whispered, her worry evident in her eyes. "Don't open the door. Let them go." I nodded, but just then, the knocking started loud and insistent. I jumped back. Fear gripped me, but I stepped closer to the door, trying to peer through the small crack. The man outside had moved closer, his face hidden beneath a tattered black raincoat. He raised his hand and pounded on the door. "Open the door," a hoarse, guttural voice called out, sending a deeper wave of dread through me. I looked at my mother, panic in my eyes. "No," my mother shouted, pulling me back. "We are not opening the door." man outside began pounding on the door even harder. At that moment, I saw two more figures emerge from the shadows, moving quickly toward the front door. It felt like we were being surrounded. My usually stoic grandfather rose from his chair, his eyes filled with worry. "We have to call the police," he whispered, but his tone was thick with fear. My mother hurriedly grabbed the phone, her hands trembling as she dialed emergency services. I tried to stay calm, but my heart pounded wildly in my chest. Outside, the banging on the door grew louder, more violent. I rushed to the back door to check the lock, but once again, I saw a dark shadow pass quickly by the kitchen window. Something was moving around the house, fast and silent, like a breeze slipping through the night. A few minutes later, the police arrived. They searched the area around the house, but found no trace of the intruders. Whoever or whatever had been there had disappeared as if they had never existed. But the damp smell of rain-soaked coats and the chilling sense of dread lingered in the air. From that day on, my family lived in a state of fear. What had started as an ordinary Thanksgiving had turned into a nightmarish ordeal that we would never forget. The silent figures under the rain that night still haunt me, and I can't help but wonder, will they ever return? It was Thanksgiving night, a night Sarah would never forget. That year, I returned to my hometown for dinner with my family. My parents were hosting the gathering at our family's log cabin, deep in the northern Pennsylvania mountains. The weather was cold, and the wind howled through the trees, casting an even gloomier atmosphere. Everything proceeded as usual, a big feast with relatives I hadn't seen in a long time. I arrived around 4 p.m., the sky already growing dark, and the house was glowing warmly with lights. A sense of peace washed over me as I saw my mother busy in the kitchen, and my father sitting in an armchair by the fireplace, laughing with my uncles. Everyone seemed to be enjoying the holiday, but deep inside me, there was an inexplicable feeling of unease. Perhaps it was the cold outside. After greeting everyone, I received a message from an unknown number. As I opened my phone, a chill ran down my spine. The message started with a disturbingly familiar greeting. "Hey Sarah, how's your Thanksgiving?" I knew right away who it was, Michael, a man I had tried so hard to forget. A few months earlier, I had met Michael through a dating app. We exchanged messages for a brief time, but I quickly realized how obsessive and strange he was in his communication. When I refused to meet in person, he became aggressive, bombarding me with accusatory and even threatening messages. I had blocked him on every platform, yet somehow his messages still reached me through unknown numbers. A rising sense of dread began to creep over me. This time, his messages were longer, more unsettling. He went on about how he had been watching me through social media, and worse, he knew I was at my parents' house for Thanksgiving. My throat tightened, and my hands shook as I read on. "You'd better meet me, Sarah. Don't make me come find you." I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. My mind raced with conflicting thoughts. Should I tell someone? Call the police? But in front of my family, I didn't want to ruin the holiday by worrying them. I decided to pocket my phone and try to ignore it. Dinner proceeded as normal. We sat around the large dining table, with turkey, mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce, and all sorts of dishes spread before us. Everyone laughed and shared old stories, but my mind kept drifting back to Michael's messages. Where was he? How did he know I was here? As everyone started cleaning up and heading to the living room, I quickly checked my phone again. More messages had come in, all from unknown numbers. This time, the content was much more terrifying. "I know who you're sitting next to. You think I can't find you?" I jumped, my eyes darting around the room. Outside the window, there was only darkness and the wind whistling through the trees. It felt like someone was watching, lurking. I whispered to my mum, "I need to step outside for a moment." She nodded absent-mindedly, not noticing the panic in my voice. I stepped out onto the porch, intending to call the police, but the biting cold of the night enveloped me instantly. Standing in the empty yard, scanning my surroundings, I felt as if I were being watched from somewhere in the woods. The pale moonlight barely illuminated the eerie shadows around the house. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. My heart raced. I didn't want to answer, but I couldn't ignore it either. Finally, I pressed the answer button. "Sarah," Michael's raspy voice crackled through, cold and threatening. "I know where you are. Don't try to hide. You'll be seeing me soon." I felt my heart clench, as if it were about to stop. Without saying a word, I hung up and rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. My whole body trembling uncontrollably, I frantically called the police, reporting what had happened. They promised to send someone to check, but I knew it would take time for them to reach this remote place. After hearing my story, my father immediately grabbed a large flashlight and an old baseball bat. "It's fine, Sarah. I'll check around the house." I tried to stop him, but he just laughed and said, "I'm not afraid of a few creeps." But none of us were prepared for what happened next. As soon as my father stepped outside, a loud noise came from the woods. It sounded like a branch snapping or footsteps crunching through dry leaves. Everyone inside the house froze, silent. The darkness outside seemed to grow thicker, colder, more dangerous. My father swept the flashlight around, but saw nothing except the shadows of trees swaying in the wind. He took a few more steps into the yard, his eyes scanning the area, but quickly returned to the house. "We should lock up until the police arrive," he said, his voice lowering. Time dragged on. Everyone sat in silence in the living room, tense, waiting for the sound of police sirens. But none of us voiced the truth that we all felt something was wrong. From the window, I caught a glimpse of a figure moving swiftly in the forest outside. A tall shape, just a fleeting moment, then gone. When the police arrived, they searched the entire area, but found nothing. A few footprints in the mud and some broken branches were all that remained. Michael had vanished, but the fear lingered. After that terrifying Thanksgiving night, I knew my life would never be the same. I filed for a restraining order and did everything I could to stay safe. But the feeling of being watched, of being stalked, would forever haunt me. In a secluded corner of the dense, tangled forests of Appalachia, nestled deep in the shadowed hills of eastern Tennessee, stood my Uncle Peter's rustic retreat. This old wooden house, perched beside a narrow, murmuring stream, had long been a place of family gathering, a familiar haven where the warmth of kinship had, year after year, staved off the encroaching cold of the wilderness. Yet that Thanksgiving would be unlike any other, and the memory of it has since clung to my mind like a curse, an echo of dread that will not cease. It was near 4 in the afternoon when we arrived, and the sky was already heavy with the weight of impending night. A bitter wind swept through the skeletal trees, its howl carrying a chill so sharp it seemed to cut straight to the bone. As we stepped inside, the scent of wood smoke from the hearth mingled with the comforting aromas of roasted meat and fresh bread, creating an odd juxtaposition to the cold dread that had begun to seep into my heart. Gathered there were not only my immediate family, but the extended kin from my mother's side, faces both familiar and distant, each illuminated by the flickering glow of the fire. yet weighed down by some unspoken apprehension. Jenny, my uncle's wife, had prepared a feast turkey, smoked bacon, bread still warm from the oven, and dishes too numerous to recall. Yet despite the abundance of food, an unshakable unease crept in as the shadows outside deepened. Before the meal began, my cousin Mark and I, drawn by the strange allure of the forest's stillness, ventured beyond the house. The air seemed thick, oppressive, as if the weight of something unseen pressed upon us from the darkening woods. As we walked, exchanging idle words about work and future plans, Mark's voice faltered. "Sarah," he whispered, "do you see that?" I followed his gaze to the edge of the dirt path where the trees closed in, their branches entwined like skeletal fingers. There, between the trunks, stood a figure, motionless, ominous. A dark shape towering among the shadows, as still and silent as a forgotten monument. My heart quickened. "It's probably just a hunter," I said, though the words felt hollow. The figure did not move, nor did it make a sound, and Mark's unease mirrored my own. "We should head back," I whispered, gripping his arm. "It's getting dark." We turned and hurried back toward the house, but even as the warm glow from the windows greeted us, the image of that dark figure haunted me. Its presence clung to my mind like the chill of the wind outside, refusing to let go. Dinner commenced soon after, the lively conversation and clinking of dishes filling the room. Yet I remained distant, casting glances toward the windows, half expecting to see the shadowy figure peering back at me. Each gust of wind outside sent shivers down my spine, as though the forest itself was stirring, restless and aware. Peter, loud, boisterous, always the soul of the party, filled the room with laughter, weaving tales that coaxed smiles from everyone. Yet Mark remained uneasy. I could see it in his pale expression, the way his gaze flickered toward the windows with a quiet fear he could not voice. Then, as the conversation lulled, Mark's voice broke the silence. "There's someone outside," he whispered, his voice trembling. The room fell into a sudden, uneasy stillness. Heads turned toward the windows, and uneasy chuckles rippled through the crowd, as if dismissing Mark's words as a joke. But I saw the fear in his eyes, and my heart sank. Uncle Peter rose from his chair, his brow furrowed but his voice calm. "Probably just someone lost in the woods. I'll take a look." He grabbed a flashlight from the shelf and, with a creak of the front door, ventured into the night. The rest of us sat in uneasy silence, the fire's glow casting flickering shadows across the walls. I exchanged a glance with Mark, our mutual fear unspoken but understood. Then, from the darkness outside, a terrible shout echoed through the trees. Peter came running back, his breath ragged, his face pale beneath the glow of the fire. "There's someone out there," he gasped, slamming the door behind him. He was just standing there, watching me, and then he vanished. Jenny's face drained of color, and a low murmur of fear spread through the room. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice cracking with panic. "Lock the doors. Turn off the lights," Peter ordered, his voice tight with urgency. We sat huddled in the dim glow of the fireplace, the windows now shrouded in darkness. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but beneath it came another sound: footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the house. Mark clutched my hand, his voice quivering. "We're not safe here, Sarah." I tried to offer reassurance, though my heart pounded in my chest. "The police will come," I whispered, though I knew the truth out here. In the remote wilderness, help would be hours away, if it came at all. Our attempts to call for help were met with silence. There was no signal, no connection to the outside world. Just as panic began to take hold, a sharp, shattering sound broke the silence. A window in the kitchen exploded inward, scattering glass across the floor. Mark dashed toward the window and picked up the object that had been thrown inside a brick, with a scrap of paper tied to it. Written in jagged, scrawling letters were the words, "Leave now, or it will be too late." Terror gripped me as I whispered, "Who's doing this?" But no one answered. Jenny cried out, urging Peter to fetch the old shotgun from the closet. But Peter's face twisted with grim resignation. "It hasn't been loaded in years," he muttered. Outside, the footsteps grew louder, closer, as if whoever or whatever was out there was preparing to make its move. Peter threw open the back door, determined to confront the intruders. But before he could act, a dark figure lunged from the shadows, knocking him to the ground. It was a mantle, gaunt, his face hidden beneath a hood, and in his hand gleamed a long, wicked blade that caught the firelight with an ominous glint. I screamed as the figure advanced toward Mark. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest chair and swung it with all my strength, knocking the man off balance. He staggered, and Mark pulled me back as the room descended into chaos. Peter scrambled to his feet, but the man was quick, recovering with terrifying speed. He charged again, and we bolted for the front door, only to hear more footsteps closing in from outside, more figures, waiting just beyond the threshold. Trapped in the darkness, surrounded by shadows and shouts, one thing became painfully clear. We were being hunted. Thanksgiving, meant to be a celebration of warmth and family, had become a nightmarish ordeal from which there would be no escape. Grey clouds blanketed the sky, pressing down on the world with an oppressive weight, while the cold wind slithered through the bare branches, carrying with it a sense of quiet menace. My name is Mark, and I've seen my share of chaos in all my years as a paramedic. But that Thanksgiving afternoon, that one was different. It settled under my skin and has stayed there ever since, like a splinter buried too deep to pull out. Sarah, my partner and friend, sat next to me in the ambulance, flipping through her phone. The lull in calls gave us a rare moment of calm, and for a second, I let myself believe it might be an uneventful holiday. But peace never lingers long in our line of work. Right around 2 in the afternoon, the radio crackled. Dispatched a Unit 5 family disturbance in progress. Officers requesting medical backup. No further details, just urgency bleeding through the static. Sarah shot me a quick look. I nodded, and she started the engine, the siren wailing to life as we barreled down the empty road. The farther we drove, the denser the woods grew, trees closing in like silent sentinels watching from the shadows. The house emerged at the end of a narrow dirt path, a hulking old thing with warped wooden siding and windows thrown wide open. The shouting inside spilled into the air, sharp and relentless. Something about the place made my stomach not an instinct, a warning. We followed the police officers inside, and the scene that greeted us was pure bedlam. Thanksgiving dinner lay in ruins, plates shattered, food scattered across the floor in greasy piles. Chairs were overturned, and the acrid sting of pepper spray burned the back of my throat. At the heart of the chaos sat Grace, a woman bent over in anguish, sobbing into her hands. Around her, 3 men, her husband Bill, and their sons John and Peter, huddled on the floor, clutching their swollen faces. The pepper spray had hit them full force, leaving their eyes bloodshot, streaming with tears. A 4th figure, a pale, trembling woman, John's wife, I guessed, stood in the corner, muttering to herself as if she was trapped in some private nightmare. When I asked one of the officers what happened, he just shook his head in disbelief. "It started over the turkey," he muttered. They couldn't agree on who should carve it. What began as a petty argument had exploded into chaos. Words were exchanged, insults sharpened like knives. John hurled his plate at Peter, who retaliated with his fists. In the madness that followed, Grace tried to break it up, grabbing a can of pepper spray from her purse and unleashing it on her sons. But instead of calming things down, John's wife drew her own can and sprayed Grace in return. By the time the officers arrived, the family had collapsed into a miserable heap, coughing and crying in a house that reeked of ruined food and toxic spray. As Sarah and I treated their injuries, a strange unease began to stir deep inside me. Something in that house felt off, not just because of the fight, but because of what lurked in the quiet spaces between the chaos. The shadows seemed heavier than they should be, clinging to the walls like old stains. And then the lights flickered once, twice before, plunging us into total darkness. The sudden silence was unnerving, broken only by the sound of labored breathing. I felt my heart hammer in my chest, my pulse loud in my ears. "Sarah, do you have your flashlight?" I whispered, struggling to keep my voice steady. She clicked it on, the narrow beam cutting through the gloom. The light swept across cracked walls and ceilings, strung with cobwebs, settling at last on the basement door that stood slightly ajar. The moment I saw it, my skin prickled with cold. Something was down there. I knew it before I even moved closer, the way you know when a storm is coming, carried on the air like a whisper just before the first drop of rain. Sarah's voice came low and tight. "Mark, do you hear that?" I listened, straining through the silence, and then I heard it, a soft, dragging sound, deliberate and heavy, like something being pulled across the basement floor. It came again, slow and unrelenting, as though whatever was down there was just waking up. The cold inside me deepened, wrapping around my spine like a fist. I knew instinctively that going down into that basement would be a mistake, a terrible mistake. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from below, shaking the floor beneath our feet. Sarah and I stumbled back, and I could feel it, now a presence, ancient and malevolent, rising from the depths of the house. Then came the whisper's soft, fragmented words that slithered up from the darkness, too faint to understand, but too clear to ignore. They carried no kindness, no warning, only hunger. We never opened that door. Whatever waited in the basement was not meant for us to disturb. We patched up the family, gathered our gear, and left the house to its secrets. The police stayed behind to finish their report, but I knew, deep in my bones, that the true story of that house would never be written on any piece of paper. It had stayed hidden beneath the surface for years, and it wasn't about to reveal itself now. Even so, the memory of that day refuses to let me go. Sometimes, in the small hours of the night, I still hear those whispers curling through my dreams, like smoke, hissing promises I don't dare decipher. I wonder what might have happened if we had opened that door. And in the silence that follows those thoughts, I know the truth. Some doors are better left closed. It was a cold, grey Thanksgiving afternoon. The kind where the air feels too still, as if it knows something awful is about to happen. My wife, Karen, and I had packed up the kids, Max, our eldest, and little Sophie, to head out to Uncle Anthony's place, just like every other year. Every Thanksgiving, Uncle Anthony hosted a grand dinner at his secluded farmhouse, tucked deep into the woods, 20 miles from town. That old wooden house always carried a sense of gloom, but because it was where the family gathered, we went anyway. Tradition has a way of pulling you back, no matter what. But this year, something felt off. as our car rumbled down the narrow dirt road that snaked into the forest. A steady drizzle began to fall. Every now and then, lightning would flicker across the distant sky, casting jagged shadows through the thick forest. The road felt endless, swallowed by the encroaching woods. Karen sat quietly beside me, staring out the window with a troubled look in her eyes. In the back seat, Max and Sophie exchanged only a few words, their usual chatter replaced by an unsettling silence. "It's just one evening. We'll be fine," I whispered to Karen, though deep down I wasn't so sure. We arrived at Uncle Anthony's around 5 o'clock. The farmhouse emerged from the twilight like some old creature too tired to hide anymore. A faint light glowed from the windows, and the wind howled through the trees, carrying the sound of our footsteps crunching against wet leaves. As we reached the porch, the wooden door creaked open. There stood Uncle Anthony, a tall man with a stern face, offering a stiff, joyless smile. "Come on in, it's getting cold," he said, his voice oddly flat. Inside, the family had already gathered Grandma and Grandpa, Uncle David, Aunt Laura, and a few cousins. They huddled around the dinner table, speaking in hushed tones, as if trying to convince themselves everything was normal. But no one laughed, not really. Conversations felt forced, as though everyone was holding their breath. The house seemed heavier this year, the cold and dampness creeping into every corner, settling deep into the bones of the place. Dinner started the same way it always did. Turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, the usual fare. But there was one difference this year. Uncle Anthony had made all the food himself. Aunt Laura, looking pale and worn, sat quietly, as if even the effort of existing was too much. Uncle Anthony said she hadn't been well, so he took it upon himself to do everything. The tension at the table was palpable, but no one dared mention it. Though the food looked decent enough, the smell of smoke from the oven clung to the air, thick and suffocating, making my stomach churn. We sat down, and that's when Uncle Anthony started carving the turkey. The way he did it wasn't right. He sliced off thick, juicy pieces and piled them onto his own plate first, leaving the burnt, dry scraps for everyone else. It wasn't just selfish, it was unsettling, like he was laying claim to the best parts, savoring them before the rest of us could even lift a fork. "Go ahead," he said, staring directly at me with a strange grin. "Don't be shy." Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. Across the table, Grandma stared blankly at her untouched plate, while Uncle David kept glancing out the window as if expecting or dreading something. From somewhere in the depths of the house, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible moaning, like a whisper carried up from the basement. "Dad," Max's voice trembled. "I hear something, under the floor." I froze, my pulse quickening. Max wasn't lying, and that terrified me more than anything. After dinner, I excused myself, needing a moment to clear my head. I stepped outside, the cold air wrapping around me like a warning. As I stood in the backyard, scanning the forest's edge, I saw it tall, at least I think I did. A shadow, large and unmoving, lurking just beyond the trees. It wasn't shaped like any animal I'd ever seen. It was watching me. I hurried back inside, not daring to tell anyone what I'd seen. The air inside the house was heavier now, thick with something unspoken. Aunt Laura curled up in her chair, her face ghostly white, drained of life. Uncle Anthony remained at the table, carving the last bits of turkey with eerie precision, his eyes gleaming with something too wild to be human. At exactly 9 o'clock, the house plunged into darkness. The lights flickered out, leaving only the dim glow of the fireplace. Shadows stretched across the room, swallowing everything. And then it came again, louder this time. A low, guttural moan, followed by heavy footsteps from beneath the floor, dragging slowly, deliberately, as if something unspeakable was rising from the dark. Karen clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Jake, we need to leave now." I stood, ready to grab the kids, but before I could move, the basement doors swung open with a thunderous creak. Out of the darkness stepped a figure tall, gaunt, and horribly wrong. It was shaped like a man, but its pale skin glistened, and its glowing red eyes burned with an otherworldly intensity. It stood silently, staring at us, as if deciding which one of us to devour first. Karen screamed a raw primal sound that sent shivers down my spine. Everyone in the room backed away in terror, but Uncle Anthony, he didn't. Instead, he grinned a smile, twisted with madness, and stepped toward the creature. "It's time," he rasped, his voice thick with anticipation. "Everything is finally in place." I grabbed Karen and the kids, dragging them toward the door. We had to get out, had to escape this nightmare. But when I flung the front door open, the darkness outside surged in like a living thing, wrapping itself around us. From the forest came shadows moving, slithering toward the house, their eyes glowing like embers from hell. We were trapped, surrounded by the dark, with nowhere left to run. Thanksgiving had become a feast of nightmares, and there would be no waking from it. The night was filled with screams and mad laughter, tangled together in the inescapable grasp of darkness.